Welcome back. Now, National Treasury faces an uphill task trying to convince members of the Parliamentary Committee on Public Debt and Privatization on a proposed change in the setting of the debt ceiling that is at 10 trillion shillings, with Kenya having already borrowed 9.6 trillion shillings, leaving little room for government to borrow the 718 billion shillings needed to finance its proposed budget. Let's have more from Jimmy Mbogo.
Treasury faces a financing hurdle, with the 2023-24 budget creating a budget deficit of 718 billion shillings expected to be financed through borrowing. The challenge is set to arise from the limitation created by the 10 trillion shillings debt ceiling, with Kenya already having borrowed 9.63 trillion shillings, leaving room to only borrow 400 billion shillings. This creates a 318 billion shillings challenge. To address the challenge, Treasury had proposed that the debt ceiling be set at 55% of GDP, but the proposal hit a snag. If the debt ceiling was to be anchored at 55% of GDP, the ceiling would be lowered to just over 7 trillion shillings, well below the current debt ceiling of 10 trillion shillings and the current debt level of 9.63 trillion shillings. In actual sense, at 9.63 trillion shillings, Kenya's debt is currently at 71.8% of GDP. It is this reality that now has the National Treasury looking to reevaluate its stand to a range of between 5% above or below its proposal of 55%. But even this is problematic.
When you began, you said that the debt in relation to GDP is at about 60%. But now we want to come to a debt anchor of 55%. Be that as it may, it means that already we are operating above the 55% that we want to achieve.
A threshold has flexibility. So when you say 55% is a threshold, and it could be plus 5% or minus 5% of that threshold. That is the flexibility.
Where is this? That, if you said 55, I thought 55 is a fixed number, 55%. Where do you get that flexibility you're talking about?
We are talking about threshold. This is what I'm trying to bring in the difference between a limit and the threshold.
But members of Parliament are still adamant that debt should be set at a nominal figure, with Treasury still bent on using a percentage of GDP to allow for the National Treasury to ensure that the country remains well within its debt-carrying capacity. Adding that increasing the overhead nominal figure alone will be counterproductive and could see the country bite more than it can chew.
As at now, if we tell you that you can borrow up to, even if you give us the limit of 15 trillion, 20 trillion, we can work with it. But what will be the impact of that to our economy? That's what we are looking at.
We are just getting the flexibility in the sense that you may have a shock on your economy. Your exchange rate really goes in an uncontrollable manner and affects your state of stock without even additional borrowing.
The lawmakers, however, remain skeptical of the amendments that could impose on their oversight role if the executive is allowed to go beyond their debt limit without prior approval by Parliament, an issue that the National Treasury argues that will not happen.
Honorable Mwalimu, who was fearing that this is taking away the power of Parliament. It doesn't, because we will be coming back to you every year to seek approval of our budget.
Once you remove powers of setting the limit, the nominal limit as you call it, from Parliament, but somebody will come and misuse this amendment and use Parliament to rubber stamp whatever they do.
The argument from the National Treasury is that moving the debt ceiling from a nominal figure to a GDP anchor will provide room for them not to keep on seeking approval from the National Assembly, an issue that the MPs say will create room for abuse in how the government spends. Jimmy Mbogo, KTN News, Nairobi.
Indeed, and that's the reflection of where we are as far as the debt ceiling is concerned. And Nidito Murithi was having scruples with editorial cartoon today, right? The budget with only a coin. You want to expound on that? Then we gravitate deeper on the debt ceiling.
Well, I was simply saying I don't understand. Well,
what do you decide for yourself? You see, cartoons people decipher them differently.
Differently.
Yes.
I guess
maybe if you have a confirmation bias down, that one also is filtering you, deciphering.
Well, look, before the break, I think the panelists were mainly saying that we are living beyond our means as a nation, but even at individual household level and so on. And I think I would agree, we have been living beyond our means. This regime came to power in part by promising that we were going to do something about that. That we would, we would not borrow as much as the previous regime was borrowing.
Yes.
I think that was one of their promise, which obviously hasn't materialized. And that is what is forcing them to go to seek a new debt ceiling. But as the introduction has pointed out quite correctly, the originally agreed GDP anchor, 55%, agreed between government and IMF. It turns out, of course, that 55% of the current GDP, the amount will be less than you have already borrowed so far, because it comes to nearly 8 trillion. So if you are going to say a percentage anchor, then you have to go to maybe 75, 80%, which obviously the optics don't look good. You see, the whole idea, it seemed to me, was to present that, oh, look, we will not be borrowing as much. We'll only borrow 55% of GDP. Now, that sounds nice on a statement, but when you go to the actual numbers, the outcome is that the actual figure or number limit would be around, as we said, between 7 and 8 trillion, which is already less than the current stock of debt, which is around 9.6 trillion. Now, so that debate, but even from a sort of intellectual rigor, I believe the so-called GDP anchor is a bit of a mirage, because if you look at the composition of GDP, a lot of what is driving growth is actually stock of public sector investments, so roads, whatever, and so on. So it's again is like the so-called GDP ratio, and so to complete the sequence, IMF and other colleagues believe we should be moving from 17% tax to GDP to something like 25%. Some of us economists argue differently, because as I talked about, the composition of the GDP, a lot of it is stock of public sector investments which do not generate taxes. And it is the same then. So even this finance bill, the aggressive taxation measures are in keeping with that kind of thinking. Then the proposed aggressive domestic borrowing is again in keeping with that kind of thinking. So this particular amendment before Parliament, to conclude, has two problems. One, you had in the intro there, parliamentarians are concerned, and rightfully so, that it is removing some power to determine the figure from them. Because the way the amendment is framed is that, put it as an anchor, if we miss the anchor, we'll be coming back to you to explain why and how long it's going to take for the remedial measure to be taken. I agree with parliamentarians, it is taking some power away from them, which they have now, to say the absolute limit is this figure. I think that's a better way. The way it is now is better for parliamentary oversight. But one and two, then the other problem I've already explained is an arithmetical kind of problem. Having agreed to 55%, what it will yield is less than the existing stock. But I wanted to tie off with the earlier conversation about what you're calling county bonds. Yes, those are a proposal. it's not well concretized, but there was a proposal talked about earlier this week or last week that could the national government issue a bond in order to use that money or that cash flow for disbursements to counties that are delayed. Now,
Expeditiously.
Expeditiously. But you see, look, government borrows all the time, as it did last week, for example. The bond was labeled infrastructure bond. But you'll be hard-pressed if you ask our colleagues in Treasury to show you which specific piece of infrastructure the 213 billion they borrowed last week was going to go and pay for. More likely, it all goes to the same pool, so it is like budget support. This week, they are at it again. They have reopened the 3-year bond they issued last month, which already, by the way, they have done 3 tap sales. So they have already picked something like nearly 60 billion out of that 3-year bond from last month, and they have reopened it again this week. They would like to get another additional 15 billion. And again, it is a infrastructure, but which bridge or which road or which infrastructure? No. So to me,
then the
idea that let's label the bond, let's label the bond that this is a county bond and use it for disbursements. But I leave it to them. I think it would be a matter of labeling. But to the question, can counties on their own motion, an individual county, issue a security? The answer is yes. The law is already in place.
The framework.
It is simply for any county to do it. Yeah? And in Laikipia, we did in fact go through the process to the point of issue.
But what was the upshot of that?
Well, the upshot is if, for example, if the current administration in Laikipia would like to...
So I'm asking, was it exceedingly beneficial for you once you floated?
No, we never did float the bond.
Eligibility.
But we got to the point of completing the process, getting the necessary approvals and so on. So any county can do that. But as Bunyasi ably explained, it has to do with your books and your cash flows. Because you are going to the market, that's what they're going to evaluate. But the counties can do that right now. The proposal that you referred to was an idea that since National Treasury says, oh, we don't have cash flow, we didn't raise enough revenue, as my friend would like to say, that, okay, can you issue a bond specifically to give you cash flow to disburse? I suppose so, but I don't see what innovation that is, or even why, because the point is that if you raise a shilling in tax, okay, if you raise 10 shillings, 1.5 shilling should go to counties directly.
Thank you.
Without,
Thank you. Let's hear from, because I think the governors now, the Council of Governors, they're in agreement also with the senators on this governor's bond. So
I think
there's concurrence on that.
I think this bond for the counties is dangerous. And I'm not surprised if the senators and governors are being prompted by the executive to do so. It is really dangerous because the constitution is very clear. Counties are supposed to be funded from the national revenue. And the government collects the national revenue. Every month, KRA publishes how much revenue it collects. They have never gone below 90% in any year, I know, below 90% of their target. So to now ask county governors go for bonds, tomorrow if the government is indebted, that will be used against the concept of devolution and the counties that, we are in this crisis because counties took loans. Counties are the ones responsible for this debt. And it would have that negative, impact on devolution in general. So I won't advise governors. They'll be shooting themselves in the foot if they went for a loan. Whatever form you call it. On this formula of debt ceiling in countries like US, debt ceiling is based on absolute numbers because it's easier then to control, not percentages. Because percentages then you have shifting, you have a moving target. If you take it as a ratio of GDP, it's a moving target. And what will happen is, if the GDP is rebased, as Uhuru did by 30% in his 10 years, then you will always as executive, manage to keep your ratio below the figure that is wrong. So it doesn't, you know, it's a crooked deal. If they accept that one, then, you know, every time they find they're above there, they just adjust and say GDP, let's expand it, rebase it, increase it by another 5%, 10%. So I think that would really be, that's why Treasury wants that, because that's a good deal for them. But I think Parliament should not allow that, because then these guys will continue borrowing. They're already borrowing, and it'll make the matter worse.
Right, but yes, you want to comment on that?
This is an interesting, as you know, very interested in this issue around this debt and borrowing. I think all these institutions will incur debt, they will borrow. The question is, are they borrowing soundly? One time I was talking about sustainable debt, and somebody said sustainable debt, that is an oxymoron. But it's not quite an oxymoron in the sense that you can have a level of debt that you can comfortably pay and meet other essential expenditures that you would have. For counties within the constitution, what has been envisaged is that they would qualify in terms of qualitative management indicators. And that's why, like Kipia, when they first proposed this, it's because they had gone through a series of steps. It can't be given to everybody. And to do that, that's one of the things that I was personally seeking. We need an authority outside of Treasury that will make these assessments. And if counties needed the support in making the assessments, they will provide those assessments. In Nigeria, for example, and I don't know at that time how many states they had, Nigeria has gone through from 16, I think they're now at 51, no, thereabouts. But the states were allowed to borrow, domestically and externally. And they actually did go out. They took the concept of governor quite some way out there. They had offices around the world. They had huge protocol around them. They are governors of the trouble, nothing like what we know here. And Nigeria is now fighting to rein them in terms of how much they can borrow. It's not going to be easy, because when you cut that back, you're going to be affecting the progress they may have on the ground. It's better to put the indicators early, the performance requirements early, and have somebody assesses, yes, they are ready to qualify for this. But once they begin borrowing, that stock of debt in the subnational governments from our counties will be part of the national debt. So if you don't have proper controls, it will, gobble up the space that the sovereign government has got in wanting to borrow more. The assessment of others will include the subnational debt. You can't say, oh, that was borrowed by Busia, we're not going to care about it. No. And what is this Busia? Busia is part of this space that we're talking about called Kenya. So getting a system that begins to develop quality indicators, letting the governments not get 1 million shilling chairs, because the prisons department is not going to do the 1 million chairs. They do high quality chairs at prices below that, because it's an important chair, because those kinds of things should just be ruled out. I don't want to say prohibited, but I would think that a responsible county is probably not going to go that route. But things will happen, and we need the rules to be set up. And for me, that surveillance must come out of Treasury. It must be something that is autonomous. Can even, sort of have a discussion with Treasury and say, hey, you guys are going way beyond your limits to pay. And this talk about ability to pay. Even they can get off track. State House will push them, perhaps, and the people will push them. They might claim that. And they never go look at expenditure. That's the point we have agreed around the table. They look at how much more we can add to it, how much more debt we can add to it.
Right. Let's hear from you, Bill.
Well, underlying what Billo said and underlying what Honourable Bunyasi said is the counties really are not being managed correctly. I think, am I wrong in that? Because, maybe, but when you're actually saying, look, the counties don't start borrowing because, you're going to get into a mess. And, well, we go back to Nderichu's point, but
yes.
But let me just, in relation to the debt, all right? We, as Nderichu pointed out, our debt at the moment is 9.6 trillion shillings. Now, 50% of that debt is external. You know, I remember when the previous president, Uhuru Kenyatta, was once asked, you know, look, what's the problem with the debt level? He told the journalists, he said, look, you know, do you know what the debt level is in Japan? It's 290% of GDP. But the problem is the following. The rate of interest on that debt in Japan is 0.01%. Okay? Now, we were talking also, and Delitu was mentioning the infrastructure bond. The infrastructure bond carries a rate of interest of 14%. Now, you know, that's about 1,000 times, 1,400 times what...
15.84 last week.
15.84%. So 1,548%, well, times what they pay in Japan. So the debt ceiling is a very, very important figure, but half of our debt is external. If we go in the last 2 years, all right, our currency has gone down by 40%. So half of 9.6 is 4.8. If you take 40% of 4.8, that's 1.92. Our external debt has gone from 4.8 trillion to 6.72 trillion simply because of the depreciation of the Kenya shilling. If we then add 4.8 billion, which is our local debt, we come to a total of 11.52 trillion. So, you know, we say, oh, well, you know, Tabu Sasi, you know, we got problems. Well, we go back to the very idea we're living beyond our means. We're importing far too much. And, you know, well, you got to remember that one of our principal earners of foreign exchange is tea. More than 50% of our tea goes to Pakistan and Egypt. The economies of both of those countries are in dire straits. So we've got a problem here. And you know, what have we got to do? We've got to, as a nation, we've got to cut back. We've got to stop buying these, you know, Jaguars and Mercedes and Prados. And, you know, as I say, in the last 20 years, we've gone from 1 million cars to 4.5 million today. And let's face it, you know, a lot of people, they're going to travel up to Naivasha over the weekend. Well, they're already there, in fact. All the hotels in Naivasha are full because of the safari rally, which it itself brings in foreign exchange. So it's a very, very fine balance here. But we've got to try to promote tourism. You know, we've really got to try to promote tourism. We've got to try to promote our exports. And, you know, the problem is, our manufacturing sector is not into really high-tech stuff. And the result is that, you know, I know a man who's got a factory right across the road here. 10 years ago, 40% of his products were in fact exported to Uganda. Now, Uganda's obviously set up a similar factory, and someone was saying a little bit earlier, you can do business much more cheaply in Uganda than you can in Kenya. So, in this case here, he no longer is able to export any of his products to Uganda. So we've got to try to be ahead of the game. And rather than knock, you know, there was a young man who wrote in the paper the other day, you know, the banks are lending to people for housing. Instead of doing that, they should be lending to manufacturers so that we can increase our 6% of GDP to 15%. People don't understand, you know, number one, that's wrong economics, okay, it's just totally wrong. But the other thing is, people don't understand we are living in a competitive world, not country, world. And we've got to compete against China. We've got to compete against India. We've got to compete against, well, even Tanzania and Uganda. In fact, we actually import a lot of stuff from Uganda into Kenya. Why? Because the cost of production there is so much lower than here. So, you know, the whole thing of the debt, you know, I think it's going to be very, very difficult. And, you know, okay, we can start rejigging it. And the point that you're making is absolutely valid. But, you know, and the point that Billow says, okay, but the fact is, we've got to raise it from 10 trillion. Because just on the foreign exchange element itself,
we are already over.
We're already above that figure.
I think we should.
Let me just hear from Billo before you go, Nderitu, because then, given the scenario that we have, do you think then it is wise for the government to be going for the Eurobond? And we see now the 150 mark that I was talking about on the front page there of the Business Daily is projecting the shilling could weaken further, 150 to 150.76 by the time it is paying its debut Eurobond. And I think that this was the first Eurobond, and he wants the second Eurobond.
Yeah, that's. I think, in my view, when you have forex exchange rate problem, you have a serious problem in the economy. Really, exchange rate problem points to the fundamentals in the economy. What he has explained: the exports, the imports, production. This is where the issue is. And since we are not addressing any of those things, we're killing exports, and we're through high taxation and high cost of energy and high cost of production and so forth. I think to go for an external debt of Eurobond,
yes,
I can assure you it's a very wrong decision, and it's going to put this country into more. But the trouble is there's an appetite for borrowing, and locally they're already causing a lot of damage. You've seen last week alone taking 13 billion out of the market. You're squeezing credit to the private sector and so forth. So there's a lot of pressure that, look, don't just borrow locally, you should go outside. But I think Eurobond is going to already we have next year to service that $2 billion previous bond, which IMF is advising government, take another loan and pay. You can take syndicated loans, you can take a loan, just pay. It's not a big deal. But I think really it would be a disaster if this government, and the bigger picture is not about whether it should be the type of loans, because they have taken everywhere. They have gone through everywhere. They have taken the concessional loans from IMF, World Bank. They are taking loans through bilateral, countries. They have gone into PPPs if that is not enough. They are taking loans from Afro-Exim Bank. They are taking loans from every possible. That's why there isn't really any option but for them to look outside, and the Eurobond seems to be attractive. But I think with our current economic situation and the way we have been downgraded by, our credit by Moody's and so forth, I don't see that to be a very attractive. If it we'll end up with very high yields on those Eurobonds, and it will be more costly again for them. The same government has predicted today in the papers, saying that exchange rate by June next year will be 150. The government saying so, and I know it's pressure from IMF and so forth, but I think it will be wrong. I think the solution to these things is simply live within our means. So focus internally on how to enhance production, how to enhance our competitiveness. Why is the Minister for Trade or the President making 1,000 trips in a few months? What is outside there? Why are you looking for investors outside? And you don't want to sit with a single sector in this country. We've asked for government to sit. Today there's crisis in the steel industry. There's crisis in the cement industry. There's crisis in the edible oil, in every sector. No one is willing to sit with the investors locally. No one is willing to sit with the industry. We are focusing on getting an investor from Saudi, another one from Belgium, another one from, and they're not coming. We're spending, billions trying to look for them. I think every country should focus on, in economics, every country should focus on where they have competitive advantage. Tea is one of the areas where we have competitive advantage globally. Black tea, we are the leading producers. If we have a crisis on it, because of the very many reasons that you're all aware of. Coffee, we also had competitive advantage, one of the best quality coffees in this country. Look at every month in December, January, you get, Starbucks and everybody coming here to buy that premium coffee so that they can blend with the coffee from Brazil and Colombia and those places. So we have an opportunity. Today, the nuts, macadamia and everybody is suffering from 120 to 20 shillings. And this, we have a competitive, so we are not helping. We are not looking, we are not sitting with these farmers and saying, what is the problem with macadamia? Why are we not able to sell? Why are we not able to sell our tea? And helping on the value. It's not about, and I was listening to this Vice President of Ghana, you've seen him all over the media, saying economics is not propaganda. It's not about, economics, you have to sit down with people and discuss. What can we do in this sector?
Yeah.
Call the media. How can we enhance productivity in the media, in content production and so on? You need to sit with, this government is focused on chasing a Muzungu or a Marabu or somebody outside the country to bring money. Anybody will not bring money here when they know the situation. When you are calling people cartels and conmen in Senate publicly, you are labeling, profiling companies who have invested hundreds of billions. Who's going to come here? So I think we have a challenge, and debt is not going to be a solution. I think government should critically look at our expenditure. Take a pen and paper and look at how they can reduce and live. Otherwise, these debts, you can play around with the ratios the way you want and say we are within sustainable and those stories. But this year, we are going to pay 1.6 trillion to service debt. 800, half of it is principal payments, the other half is servicing of interest. 1.6 trillion. Our revenue is projected to be 2.5 trillion, my friend. I mean, we can't continue that way. Nobody should cheat us that way. Our debts are sustainable. They're not.
Yeah.
They're not.
We're just saying now we are servicing debts. Looking at the running expenditure, it's almost 447. Let me just get the facts right here from the Business Daily. So we're not living our financial truth. Debt expenses surpass cost of running states by 44.7 billion shillings. Bunyasi Sako, I just wanted to ask on the issue, especially even we talk about the servicing of debt, running the state expenses. If we flip on the back of Daily Nation, procurement and this procurement agency of ours, because we've been having cases of NHIF, KEMSA, we are always waiting for the other shoe to drop as far as procurement scandals are concerned. Are they effectively doing their job?
I think that the law...
because all these tenders, I believe at the end of the day, this eye-popping figure, there's a threshold that really now has to be given thumbs up by the procurement, the Public Procurement Authority, isn't it?
Yes. The reason we hear so much about it is because the law in some way is restrictive and they are overstepping each time, or trying to overstep and so on. So what needs to be done is greater vigilance in keeping them...
How is the law restrictive?
The law
if you may just educate me so that I know.
Okay. Usually some things are obvious, that you have clear specifications of what you need, and that you give people enough time, enough suppliers enough time to generate their proposals, and that you have evaluation committees that are constituted in some way, there isn't incestuous relationships in there. Attempts are made to separate this process and so on. And then there are also continuing attempts, like the meteorites, out there, attempting, fearing that they will strike us in time. Fortunately, they don't. But there are always attempts to try and dilute this, bypass this, and so on. So what is needed goes back to what we said earlier on, that if we fight these kinds of attempts aggressively, over time, people will realize that I can't go that route. And in this country, what has proven that's doable, that you can hang somebody onto it, is through procurement. People steal billions, and you can't prove that they have the money and so on, because the money comes around to fight back. That's the money you're looking for. Shows up in other ways and fights back the law. But in respect to procurement, that's the only areas we've been able to pin down a number of people. And I think the law is good. It's the greed that it has not been able to curb, and we should find other ways in which you can handle that.
So if the cure should begin from that particular agency, why would we be servicing, or why would we be paying taxes to this particular authority? We don't feel the effect of public procurement at all. All that we are reading every day is, what I'm just mentioned, the scandals. Let me just ask Director Muredi.
Yeah.
Well, on this NHIF issue that you referred to,
not even basically NHIF, just broadly speaking, about all the scandals we've had, because the source is procurement.
Well, government works through procurement. If you're building a road, you hire a contractor. If you're providing insurance cover for your civil servants, you get an insurance company and so on. So from an execution point of view, procurement is where it happens, and I guess that's where you will find the scandals. Although I feel that...
No. I'm actually focusing on the authority, not the procurement officers within government. This particular authority that is given the oversight to make sure that the flouting of procurement rules does not happen.
And the Public Procurement Regulatory Authority, like a number of other institutions, you have to move it. I mean, it doesn't, it is that tenderers will complain to it that I think something is going wrong with this tender. It's not, I hope you understand my point. So they come
it's just on a regulatory...
No, they come to the table slightly after the fact. Because they are responding to complaints by tenderers. So perhaps a change could be, could they look at these tenders even if tenderers are not complaining? Could they audit them, for example, on their own motion without waiting to respond to complaints? And perhaps that could improve their effectiveness. But you see, once again, I feel we've gone to the symptom. The point that Biro Cairo made here, and I think even Jim, about the budget itself, well, why should it be 4.5 trillion? I mean, what is the justification for it? Now, our way of budgeting generally is to use the previous year as the baseline. So if you go, I don't know, Ministry of Interior, if the budget for fuel or budget for, I don't know, hospitality services was 300 billion last year, then they tack on to that an increment of say 10 or 20 billion. But if you think about it logically, if our travel budget in our department was say 50 million or 30 million last year, why should it be now 35 million this year? Maybe there are no projects we are supervising. Why should we be traveling? So a better way would be to start from zero, that every vote must be justified from zero based on the work that is going to be done. Not this using last year as the baseline, regardless of whether there is any justification for it. We already spoke a bit here to the question of duplication, and I think we used the Ministry of Health. That, truthfully, the work that the Ministry of Health should be doing is way less than the resources that are being allocated to it. That's why you are finding the Ministry of Health pretending to know better how to build a level 3 hospital in counties, yet there is a whole bureaucracy at county level to deal with that. So what you do, you are duplicating, and therefore it is wasteful. And it's not just in health, it is also in agriculture, it is in water, it is even in roads. So the real question, Kenya, we should be addressing is about the expenditure side, which is what my colleagues have already said. What we are seeing here, these scandals are symptoms of something. And perhaps they explain why the effort to grow budgets at the center is probably to create opportunities then for procurement that enriches people. But we are not interrogating the expenditure side of the budget, and that's what we should really ought to be investigating. And remember how the budgeting process, both at county and national level, works. You make the expenditure decision first. So if you look at the budget policy statement from February, it's already said government's plan is to grow the budget to that now 4.5 trillion. If you remove the debt component, that, like the principal repayments, then they'll say, oh, the budget is 3.6 trillion. But why should it be growing to 3.6 trillion? What is the justifiable reason for it? Unless we interrogate that particular point, what we are doing now on whether we should borrow or whether we should tax, I mean, the horse has already left, and we are trying to bolt the stable. The issue is on the expenditure. Why should this expenditure be happening? And if you agree with the expenditure, almost by definition, you have to agree with the borrowing and the taxation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Bill, Jim, you want to say something?
Well, you see, what amazes me is that you get people who, for example, become members of parliament, members of the county assemblies, and suddenly, you know, they become addicted to spending as much money as possible. I have a friend in KRA, and in round about this time last year, it was a little bit earlier in the year because the financial year end of the government is the 30th of June. But he was on a seminar run by KRA in Mombasa. He came back to Nairobi, and we met in Nairobi, and he said, well, look, you know, I'm going up to Embu because we've got another seminar up there. I said, what are you going to do in this other seminar? You've already had one in Mombasa. Why go to Embu now? He said, well, you know, the problem is that we've got to spend up to our budget, because if we don't do that, it's going to be cut next year. And, you know, if you go to some of these international conferences, I remember once I was talking to a lady who's a member of the Institute of Certified Public Accountants of Kenya. She works in Kengen, and she had actually been on a seminar in Singapore, and a colleague of hers said to her, look, there are too many MCAs here. Mm-hmm. This is a seminar on finance, and the MCAs have a very good point. Well, we need to know about finance, but in fact, they're not dealing with the day-to-day things of finance. They're dealing with topics which will, you know, entertain possibly the members of the Institute of Certified Public Accountants of Kenya. Now, you know, but you see, all the time we're actually saying, look, you know, this has got to be the case. This has got to be the case. Such and such a thing has got to be the case. The only thing is, we will never get a change unless we change the system. And this is where, to my mind, you know, we got to think now. Mohammed Badi, the day that he was appointed to the NMS in Nairobi, I could see changes occurring within a week of his being appointed. Within a week, you see changes occurring because of his appointment. And he was a man, you know, he actually had something like, I don't know how many hospitals built in the slums. Mohammed Badi, he was appointed. He was answerable. Sonko, okay, I'm dealing with an individual, okay, but, you know, the problem is, if I've got a lot of money, I can always get elected. And, you know, even in the United States, Hunter Biden, the son of the president, is found guilty, okay, of certain crimes. His father, who's the president, pardons him. This is, you know, this so-called, you know, leading democracy in the world. So, you know, we've got to change the system, because we're saying, okay, we've got to have people to become more responsible. I'm afraid that doesn't work, okay? This whole thing, you know, what does my senator do for me? What does my member of parliament do for me? What does my the governor of Nairobi, okay, he's got a job to do, okay? But all of my MCAs, what do they do? They're getting, you know, fairly good salaries, okay? And when I was in Scotland doing my PhD, the Scottish Parliament was formed. They were going to get a salary of £2,000 a month. The first thing they did in, you know, the Parliament in Scotland, the first thing they did was to increase their salaries to £4,000 a month. So when you have that power, and, you know, I pity the SRCC. Why? Because they come out and say, well, look, we're going to cut back on all these various gifts and so on that you're getting as members of parliament, etc. They almost lose their jobs there. You know, so the point is, you know, unfortunately we have an incredible level of irresponsibility. Now this is the case all over the world. You know, I never understand people, you know, they buy a house for 200 million shillings and then they want one for 400 million, and you know, I sleep in the same bed. Even if I have sheets of gold, it's uncomfortable. Maybe I make myself.
Let's just wind up with the story on a lighter note as well. It's not all gloom and doom, because now Kenya and the European Union have completed the negotiations on an economic partnership agreement to enable Kenyans access the European market. We have more from Noah Kipkemboi.
In the European Union Economic Partnership Agreement were finalized in 2014 in a joint framework between the European Union and the East African Community. The deal, however, stalled following the failure by EAC states to sign up to the agreement. 8 years on, and Kenya has charted her own course, putting pen to paper on its own deal.
Kenya's exports to the EU will be tariff-free from the day one after its entry into force.
The agreement will grant Kenyan products immediate, duty-free, quota-free entry into the EU from the day it comes into effect. And in recognition of our varied stage of progress along the development journey, products from the EU will progressively receive duty reductions over a period of 25 years.
Kenya will, however, be looking to scale up its exports of manufactured goods to increase its returns. The EU accounts for 20% of Kenya's exports, but the balance of trade is skewed in the EU's favor, with Kenya importing goods worth 2 billion euros but exporting goods valued at 1.2 billion euros.
Kenya is now working on our manufacturing capacity, that most of the products that we export today, including our tea, including our coffee, we have to take them now through the process of value addition, processing, and manufacturing so that we can export finished products, we can derive more value, and we can put more money in our farmers' pocket. We have removed taxes on packaging material to facilitate export of finished products that are packed by Kenyan and European partners working together to export our products.
With strict standards on agricultural products, EU development assistance will support farming and rural employment and farmers' capacity to comply with agricultural standards. The Economic Partnership Agreement will have to go through legal revision and then be translated before the European Commission submits it for signature and conclusion to the Council, after which Kenya and EU will sign. This will go through EU Parliament, after which the parties may decide to provisionally apply parts of the agreement. Then Kenya and EU will ratify it, bringing it into force. Now, Kipkemboi, KTN News.
To retreat, then the rest of us will.
Okay, we want just to get our headline thoughts as we're winding up. Let's just begin with you, Bill Okero, briefly. Your headline thoughts. Closing
on the EPA. The EPA, I think, is an agreement that is long overdue. It's been in discussion for quite a while after the ACP, EU agreement came to an end. But East African community countries have been reluctant to sign the agreement because of a number of reasons, and Kenya has decided now to go alone and sign, and I think without waiting for the East African community countries, and I guess we will see how it plays out also in East African community countries, but I think it's important that
Thank you, Bilo. Because of time, briefly, 10 seconds.
let's live within our means.
Let's
and
live
borrow less.
That speaks volumes. Let's hear from you. Your closing remarks.
I didn't add much, but I'm just happy with the level of public debate around public expenditure issues and taxation as well.
Thank you. Dr. McPhee.
Let's finish on that last point. Congratulations to the government for negotiating that treaty, and it is going to make exports to the European Union easier. So congratulations. We're doing something for Kenya, and that's the important thing to do all the time. Do things for the country, not for me.
Do things for the country, not for me. I think a better place to wind up. Thank you very much for watching Sokoni here today on Morning Prime. Don't go away, much more on the other side of a break. Ms. Diary is on its way.